Welcome to this session on climate investigations. I am Kate Gammon. I'm a freelance science journalist based here in LA, and I am very excited to have this conversation with three amazing journalists, and we're going to talk about what it takes to put together an investigation, especially around climate. So I'm going to very briefly introduce them. Sammy Roth is energy reporter at the LA Times. We've got Maanvi Singh, West Coast reporter focused on environmental and health justice for The Guardian. And we've got Gabrielle Canon, journalist and photographer with The Guardian, and they are both based in the Bay Area. So when we talk about investigations, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And in my experience in journalism, it is increasingly thrown around. So what exactly is an investigation? Is it different from explanatory journalism? Is it different from other types of journalism? What's an investigation to you?
Should I just jump in?
Yeah, jump in.
I think an investigation certainly relies on trying to turn over something that isn't already out there. Looking at, maybe it could be data, maybe it could be working more deeply in a community. It's a broad term that has a lot of applications, but I don't necessarily think it's the same thing as explaining or even describing. But I do think that there is space to use investigative reporting in those types of stories. So I think it's an approach that you could use to not only do a deeper fact check, but to make sure that you're actually telling the real story that's there, and then just taking a deeper look that maybe that's just not something about just on the surface.
I guess my mic might be.
Yeah, I think it's.
Mic on? I guess I have a little bit of a heretical take on this one, and not that I disagree with anything Gabby just said, because I think that's a fair definition of investigation. I think from a reader perspective, there's not a lot of difference between an investigation and explanatory versus other types of reporting. I just mean that I think that's a distinction that, while it might be important to journalists, is probably not that important or noticeable to people consuming our work. So I mean, I've done like sort of traditional, what you would call investigative journalism, where you're filing many public records requests and combing through government data to turn over and publicize information that someone is trying to stop from getting out into the public realm. Most of what I do would probably be more typically categorized as explanatory, to use the term that Kate and Gabby used, of taking information that's already out there, in my case about energy, about what fuel sources are generating electricity and why aren't decision makers changing that more quickly, and what would be strategies for moving things along for climate. I do a lot of explanatory stories that at the same time take information and maybe put it into forms that people hadn't seen it in before, or thought about it in before, or ask really difficult questions about why are things the way they are. And maybe that's not an investigation in the typical sense of the word, of finding information that's not in the public realm and putting it out there, but I think that those types of journalism can serve a similar purpose for readers, and sometimes the distinctions aren't as important as we make them out to be.
Cool. Maanvi, you have a thought?
Yeah, I know I'm on this panel, and I agree with everything that's been said, and I have to admit that I actually have never been able to define what an investigative or what investigative journalism is. But yeah, I think that's a good perspective, that readers just, I think they're just kind of looking for in-depth stuff that helps them better understand the world. And sometimes that is very new information, or some new way of crunching data. And sometimes that's just, describing something that's been going on for a long time that bigger publications have never bothered to pay attention to before. And sometimes it's explaining what this very complicated and sort of hard to access knowledge about how the energy system works. And I think all of that can be investigative, and it's more just sort of your depth and commitment to the story.
That's a great definition. I once asked Mark Schoofs, who was the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed and the head of their investigations, why investigations? And he said it's the same as every other type of journalism. It just takes more time, which I thought was really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of investigation in your newsrooms. Where do the ideas come from? Do they come from the public, from your editors, from your own work? And how much time and resources do you know that you have to invest in these types of stories?
Well, I guess I'll go. I mean, I think it really depends. There are so many different types of stories and places that you come to from your reporting. So in terms of, okay, one thing could be something that someone sent you. This is a document that I have that shows something new about something you've already covered. Another thing that I think is pretty common is if you start sort of down the road of doing reporting, if you're on a scene in breaking news, obviously your main initial reporting objective is going to branch off into a variety of different new ideas and new sources and new bits of information. And so I think a lot of times where my ideas come from is just being in a place, trying to better understand the complex mix of what's contributing to this issue that I'm covering, and then trying to ask certain questions that might lead me down a path. And then trying to sort of build on previous reporting. So rather than trying to just bite off a big, like, giant story that might take a lot of resources and a lot of time, it's sort of like starting to just pull that thread.
Yeah, the time aspect is really interesting. And to go back for a second to what Kate said about investigations are the same, but just take more time. I used to work with a graphic designer in the LA Times newsroom and a data specialist who I approached once about a big project that I wanted to do, and the first advice he gave me was, don't call it a big project, it'll take twice as long. Which is not, not specific to the LA Times newsroom, but I think a feature of any, large journalistic or even small journalistic institution, where when you start describing things in a certain way, suddenly it's, we have to put all these resources into it, and we have to, be 3 times as careful, not that we're not always super careful about everything we say. So definitely some of them get started in the way that Gabby described, where at least in my experience, you get a document from someone. A couple of years ago, when I was at the Desert Sun newspaper in Palm Springs, I'd been covering efforts to do lithium extraction down at the Salton Sea in the desert in California. And basically out of nowhere, there'd been rumors that Tesla had been sniffing around and was maybe interested in getting involved down there. And out of nowhere, from an anonymous tipster, who I never actually learned the identity of, although I have my suspicions, I got a copy of a letter sent to me of Tesla making an offer to purchase this startup for a very large sum of money, and I was able to run it down and confirm that. But that was an example of a quote unquote investigation just showing up in my inbox. And then a lot of stuff I would say comes from just the reporting that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, sort of like what Gabby was saying, where you cover a topic day in, day out, and slowly it dawns upon you, gee, I'm sort of biting off pieces of this, but I think there's something larger here that deserves, me to slow down and stop and develop some more time on it. So right now, for instance, I'm in the middle of, and I don't know if you'd qualify this as a traditional investigation or explanatory or whatnot, but I'm in the midst of doing a series of road trips to different parts of the western United States and doing a series of stories of how the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is playing out in different small towns and landscapes and ecosystems, and sort of putting this all together into a big package. And that kind of just came from a place of sort of over the last 7 or 8 years writing about energy, of seeing, gee, there are all these examples of solar farms that are actually opposed by conservation groups, which is interesting, or small rural towns that depended on fossil fuels but are now embracing renewables. And you start to do that day by day, and you think there's probably something larger here that's worth doing a quote unquote investigation on. So I think there are different ways it can happen.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like sometimes it's just actually a colleague of mine at The Guardian, who's our Julie Carey Wong, she told me this, where she was just like, yeah, the best investigation starts when you actually don't know the answer to something. Because I do think a lot of our reporting, we do kind of know the answer, but it is also our job to explain the answers to the public, and you got to put those stories out. But sometimes you're just like, I have no idea why this is happening, but it just keeps happening. And yeah, sometimes those yield really good investigations, because that is whatever, unexplored territory. And I guess another source for me is also just collaboration. I've been really lucky to work with really talented journalists who kind of meld their skill set with mine, and then we're able to create some kind of story that maybe wouldn't have existed if we hadn't come together. And so, you know, like I always like to team up with people who are much better at data than I am, and like, you know, people who, or even sometimes scientists who might want to share exclusive like numbers that they've gathered. And that's kind of always a great way to like, yeah, I don't know, bring together types of knowledge that don't tend to like naturally go together usually.
Wonderful. And when it comes to investigations, are there any special steps in your newsroom, legal or editorial, extra oversight, or is it pretty much the same process plus time?
I mean, I think the only thing that I would say is that if you're dealing with a company that you think is potentially going to be litigious, especially when you're turning over truly new or damaging information, that the lawyer's going to get involved and review that. Always fun to go through the general counsel process, but frequently our lawyer actually has good edits and suggestions, so that can be valuable.
Yeah, in addition to that, I think, I mean, this isn't, again, I guess it's like a loose description of investigation, whatever that means, but the stories that like I spend more time on, I do a more thorough like fact check. I mean, of course, check facts always, but like, you know, much more thorough where you call back sources, make sure things are both up to date and like this is actually what they meant, and like, you know, call back like everybody you interviewed in a community or reach out to them again and say like, here, this is something that's coming out. Like, did anything change? Like, is this like kind of what you meant when you talked to me originally? Is this, you know, the perspective you still have, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we certainly get to benefit from having a really collaborative team. We have incredible editors and copy editors, and I think that sort of helps also create a fail-safe of not only making sure that your story is watertight and that the message is clear, but also I think being really thoughtful about language. And we have newsroom discussions about sensitivity and about just those layers that sometimes get forgotten and when things get busy. But so I feel that there's definitely that space at The Guardian, which has kind of helped us, I think, get ahead of certain issues.
Awesome. I mean, both your publications have a remarkable track record in breaking news and investigations. Is there anything that you would like to call out as, you know, something that everyone here should read, that we'll tweet out as our top best of list, either your work or someone else's work?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me, if you don't mind my tooting the Los Angeles Times horn a little bit, we published an investigation, I think it was about 2 years ago at this point, right around the beginning of the pandemic, about abandoned oil wells here in Los Angeles and in California as a whole. And it was, you know, Ryan Menezes was one of the reporters, and the other one was Mark Goleld, who's at ProPublica now, and they just did this amazing like deep dive into the data and into community reporting, showing, you know, all over Los Angeles, you know, sort of right beneath our noses here, there are, you know, thousands and thousands of abandoned oil wells and gas wells that are in many cases, you know, not properly sealed and are, you know, seeping fumes into neighborhoods, particularly low-income neighborhoods with a lot of people of color, which is not that surprising. But they you know, they really ran down the data and showed how, you know, scary this problem is, and they did a version of the story for the whole state. That's one I would point out. And then I would also say we have a reporter at LA Times, Ian James, who covers water. He's done great stuff at the LA Times. I previously worked with him at the Desert Sun in Palm Springs, and he did this amazing investigative series looking at groundwater overpumping. And what he did, which was super cool, he got a grant and traveled all over the world and started with California and the Central Valley and sort of did a series of stories comparing what the problem was like here to what it's like in India and parts of South America and different countries all over the world, to sort of zoom out and show what a global problem it was. So those would be two I'd recommend.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Yeah, those are great. I also agree. But I think one of the projects that I really loved at The Guardian was, we did this a couple years ago, and it was about public lands and loving our parks to death. And one of the things that made this so special was there were reporters across the West who contributed to this project. It's something that we thought a lot about, and I certainly is something really close to my heart. And this really complicated issue of these public spaces that are so cherished and also increasingly destroyed. And the idea of how do we create more access and ensure that that access is more equitable, since these are areas that have traditionally been dominated. And at the same time, as we make sure that that balance, striking that balance between conservation, preservation, and then also instilling that love and that legacy so that future generations can love these spaces. So that was definitely something as beautiful photography and I think an angle that that has now been thought about quite a bit more since we've done that project.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, I really love like investigations that kind of put out lots of information to like inspire more stories. So like, I know ProPublica does this a lot, but like, you know, I really like their Great Climate Migration story, which, you know, they also kind of do make an effort to like get the ball rolling. Here's new data and here's new analysis, but then they, you know, put it out there for you to like be able to look up how this is happening in your region, and you know that would hopefully give rise to more stories. Also, The Intercept, I think it was The Intercept. Yeah, sorry if I. No, it was definitely The Intercept. Did the kind of comparison of climate crisis, climate catastrophe, and where that's happening, as comparing that to data of like where correctional facilities are. And that's like other data where they did a few broad stories looking at different regions, but obviously they have this data from all over the country, and hopefully that will give rise to even more stories of how people in correctional facilities are especially vulnerable.
I just want to cut in and say that reminds me there was an amazing investigation that High Country News published just this week or last week by Sarah Sneath that was about how people who were incarcerated in state prisons in Washington State were suffering so badly during that heat wave last summer, and you know, turning over public records at all of the, you know, they were basically like roasting in there and afraid of dying, and the prison system was doing nothing for them. That was a really good one. I mean, terrible story, but great journalism.
Wow, those are all amazing, and we will add those to our social media, and so everyone can enjoy. Where do you see investigations and activism working together, or sort of how do you know what the limit of, you know, your work as a journalist is, and where people wanting to take an activist kind of motion ends? Like, how do you navigate that?
I guess I'll go. Especially when I do like more environmental justice stories, but I think this has come up like throughout my whole career. And obviously, like, I'm not advocating usually for like a specific policy, or I'm not the one like going to like directly to leadership being like, this needs to happen for my community or something. But I've tried to like get rid of a lot of like the sort of traditional journalistic whatever way of trying to be like, oh, we're just objective, like whatever, we're not going to get into this. Like, especially as someone who reports on like health or climate, like you have to, I mean, a lot of these things that you report, I mean, like, you know, we have kind of a human right to a future, to water, to, you know, healthy living conditions. And especially when you talk to people who are directly or more directly being affected by some of this, I think it's just kind of like a jerk move to be like, well, you know, I'm gonna like just be emotionally distant from this and kind of get both sides, because, you know, you're at the end of the day, this is like human rights you're talking about, and I think it's almost sort of more useful and more, I don't know, not more objective, but whatever. Like I don't try to like distance myself too much from advocacy to the detriment of a story.
Yeah, I mean, you can't remove your humanity from your work, and I think that as long as, you know, the work is rooted in facts, and that there's a strong sense of ethics involved in, you know, knowing what your intention is, and if your intention is speaking truth to power, if it's highlighting egregious, like I think a lot of the things that you raised, environmental justice issues, I think that that's something that is specifically rooted in journalism and is separate from advocacy. I think that a lot of times our work is an important fuel for advocacy, and so what I often try to, the way that I sort of view my role is in trying to provide actionable information. So rather than, I think like you said, echoing what Maanvi said, like we're not necessarily the ones going out and saying, oftentimes, not all the time, certainly there are some clear-cut issues here, but saying, okay, this is the law that should be passed, or this is, the action that should be taken. It's sort of like, this is the issue in a contextual, deeper framing, and hopefully being able to then, push that issue more towards progress. But I do think that, in this world now, when some of these lines are being blurred, in order to, it's important to maintain trust. And so there has to, I think, be a really honest conversation with what the intention is, where we stand, and how thorough and dedicated our facts are, our fact-checking process is. Because that is something that, even if the work that we're doing isn't necessarily rooted in advocacy, I think if there is a perception that there's, how do I even frame this? That there's, that you're not approaching your work honestly, I guess, then that I think will, it'll wreck the opportunity to actually have an impact.
Yeah, I agree with Maanvi and Gabby here that we have a very strong role as journalists in being very clear about what the crisis is and why solutions are needed, and sort of, trying to push society forward, and being transparent about the fact that we're doing that we do believe we have a right to clean air and clean water and a habitable planet, and that we do believe that, especially for people on the front lines of the climate crisis, that it's our job to, spotlight what is happening to them and push for action, push for political action. But that also that the place, sort of to draw the line for journalism is, advocating for specific solutions. That, I don't think that's our role. I think that, we spotlight the problem, and we, make it clear that action is needed, and use our own voices for that if needed. But, then the difference to me between journalism and activism is I'm repeating Maanvi and Gabby here, but just, we're not out there saying, go pass a law requiring 100% clean energy by this year. We're out there saying clearly there's a, enormous need to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as possible based on the science, and, here are different options for doing that, and here's, who that's going to benefit, and here's what the, the consequences are of not doing that. All that said, I do think there's a role for different types of journalism, and, maybe that's the kind of journalism that we're doing here for the LA Times and The Guardian, which I think is very valuable. There are also, journalists out there for, publications with a, explicit progressive bent, or independent, newsletter writers, or even people like Bill McKibben, who's a well-known climate activist, but also does, really incredible journalism for The New Yorker, and does, deep reporting where he's honest about where he's coming from, which is that he's, one of the leading climate activists out there. So I think there's a role for all of that, and just the fact that, we're not doing that type of advocacy journalism doesn't mean that there isn't value in having that in the world.
Awesome. I'm glad that we're all able to come out as pro-future and pro-air. No, it's a good thing. So how do you measure your success in an investigation? You talked about knowing what your goals were, Gabby, but what does it mean to achieve them?
That's such a great question, and one that I think that we should constantly be asking ourselves in our newsrooms of our own work. I think so often it's easy to get into that realm of like, oh, this got so many clicks, like, look how great I did. When the end game is really, in what ways did you start conversations? And it's hard because for me, if that's a metric that I'm moving towards, it's immeasurable, right? Like, I'm not gonna ever know if that one person who read my story went home and called their mom and changed her mind. And so I think when it comes back to looking at the work that I'm doing, I think if I'm able to move the conversation forward, if I'm able to get enough momentum to continue to tell that story, that's a way that I try to determine whether or not I'm having an impact. I think it's also, for me, if we're able to bring new voices into spaces they haven't been before, or give platforms to those who don't always get the chance to share their perspective, I think that's another area where I can say, okay, even if this didn't move legislation, or if I couldn't, shift the entire tone of this problem, at least we're starting to get this momentum out there. We're starting to get new voices into this space.
I mean, yeah, I guess just to add to that, all those great points you raised, Gabby. You know, I also, I guess a couple of other things are just, and also this is kind of connected to the advocacy issue, is like when we report on, like, for example, something really bad happening somewhere, like, we do kind of want that to, like, you know, like, we want our reporting to, like, help make something change or make something different or make something better for a community. And so in the cases that that is able to happen, that's, like, wonderful. If, like, you highlight some sort of issue and you know, people start changing a policy or removing a bad policy. But also, I think, you know, sometimes a good way to measure impact too is like when other journalists kind of continue the story, when, you know, you do something and someone else does something else to kind of further that along, or finds a similar trend in like what's happening in their community. That's always kind of an exciting thing for me.
I think the only thing I'd add here is that I think this is a question that highlights the value of local journalism and local reporting, because it's like, you know, it's so easy as a journalist covering climate and climate-related stuff to get frustrated all the time as you see, you know, that just the pace of progress at a, you know, at a state level, at a national level, at a global level is just, you know, so glacial. I mean, it's just, you sort of sometimes feel like you're screaming into the wind, and why am I doing this if we're still either, you know, at times going backwards and at best going much slower than we need to be. But so to me there's, you know, there's really value, and I've experienced this at the LA Times, of feeling like, okay, if, you know, maybe I can't change the direction of the world or the state or the country, but at the very least it's easier to sometimes see, you know, the hand that good journalism can have at shaping things at a local level. So for instance, I did some stories a couple of years ago spotlighting the fact that the LA Department of Water and Power, it operates this big coal plant up in rural Utah, and it's the largest source of power for Los Angeles. And the decision had been made several years earlier that they had been planning to just operate this coal plant indefinitely, and then finally, you know, about 10 years ago, they said, okay, we're gonna tear down the coal plant and we'll build a gas plant in its place, and that'll be much cleaner. And that was a decision made at a time when natural gas was, you know, really widely seen as a, you know, a clean, climate-friendly alternative to coal. And that was an issue that hadn't really been revisited or spotlighted in a significant way, even as the science became clearer and clearer of no, investing in any fossil fuel, including gas, is probably not the way forward most of the time if we want to, you know, keep warming below, you know, below 1.5 or 2 degrees. And you know, some activists had started to talk about this locally, but it really wasn't part of the conversation. So I went up there and I did a big piece that the LA Times, you know, spotlighted. It was on our front page. It led our website. It was, you know, a significant, you know, act of reporting, asking why on earth is LA tearing down its coal plant only to invest in another fossil fuel. And, you know, it didn't immediately have an impact. I sat, you know, for several months after this thinking, gee, this made no difference whatsoever. But then, you know, people started talking about it again, and activists came forward and started pressing on it. And by the end of that year, LA had come out and said, okay, you know, we're going to do something, you know, we're going to do something different. We are going to build the gas plant. We're going to convert it to hydrogen. It's, frankly, the details are complicated, and also my story wasn't the only thing that caused that. But it did feel like, okay, I was able to get this conversation going again, and I think that was a contributing factor here in you know, public policy changing. So, you know. Local is sometimes a lot easier to wrap your heads around as a journalist than, you know, national or global.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of having impact, of direct impact. Yeah, I love what you said, Sammy, about local reporting and California-based stories. So here we are in California, and this is a West Coast climate crisis symposium, and so we're focused on this region and this area, and there's a lot of special stuff happening here. Is there a California story that if your editors would only say yes and give you a year to work on, you would do to the ends of the earth? Is there something nerdy and small that you would just take and run with if you had all the resources in the world?
Oh my gosh, that's such an exciting and challenging question.
I feel very self-conscious that my actual editor is in the audience. She approves all the stories that I want to do, so no notes.
Ooh, I mean, I think, oh, go ahead, go
No,
ahead.
you please.
I thought I was off the hook for a second. I was like, oh, phew, okay. I honestly think this is maybe a cop-out because there are so many stories that are kind of on my list right now that we're getting to, and I'm excited to work on. So this is a bit of a generalization. I won't go into detail, but I think if there was an opportunity to be more collaborative across newsrooms, I think that's something I would be so eager to do. If there were ways that we could share resources and to tackle some of these impossible problems, I think that would be a really important way to add value to not only for our readers and viewers, but also I think just there's so much knowledge in journalism. I mean, we had a great conversation over lunch actually today, and just talking about like competition in the sense of like these different stories that we're all trying to go for, and ultimately we're all on the same team. And I think if there were more potential for us to each cover different aspects of this huge story together, that would be really exciting.
I mean, I'm kind of lucky in that the project I described earlier of the Western energy transition road trips that I'm doing, that kind of is my dream story, and my editors greenlit it. So I'm lucky at the moment. I was with a photographer and a video team at the beginning of last month, and we went up to Wyoming to the site of this ginormous wind farm that is just starting construction. That's going to be hundreds and hundreds of wind turbines that Phil Anschutz, this billionaire up there, is building. And then we followed the route over 700 miles of a power line that he's going to be building as well to basically sell all of that wind energy into California. So building this power line across 4 states. So that was an amazing trip, and we stopped at Flaming Gorge Dam and did stuff on the Colorado River and hydropower, and stopped at a coal plant. And this is number one of 5 or 6 big trips that we're planning. So that I'm lucky. That's my dream story in progress, and so I have nothing to add on top of that.
How long did it take you to pitch that story to your editors?
Surprisingly, it was not that hard to get the pitch approved. The only thing was I first started talking with them about it in January 2020, and then the pandemic happened, so it was delayed for 2 years. But no, when you have a really good idea and you have a smart, thoughtful editor, sometimes it's not that hard.
Awesome.
I guess this isn't quite like a story per se, but something I've been thinking a lot about is how to have more impact, or how to be more useful, I guess. And I mean, I only have half-baked thoughts, but I guess if we had lots of resources and nothing else to think about for a while, I would love to just think more about, how do we help, usually, especially with some place like The Guardian we're covering, it's an international newspaper, and we do try to be useful to the local communities that we report on, but we're not local journalists. But I guess, finding lots of different ways to, once you finish the story, what do you leave that community with? Are there resource guides? Are there conversation starter things? Are there events? Are there ways to bring different communities going through the same issues together to broaden the discussion? Just ways to continue a story, I guess, no matter how long you spend on it or how many words it is. I feel at some point it feels okay, is this over? But especially with something like climate, it's so massive, it's so global, it can feel really overwhelming. Or even if we always usually write about bad things, and it's well, how do people internalize that and process it, and actually besides writing to your senator, what are ways in which we could keep kind of engaging readers or communities to keep the story going?
Yeah, I love that idea, just giving your story more life, an extra life. I would love to hear from the audience if anyone has a question for our amazing panel. Don't be shy.
Hi, could you address, can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you address the question that was the title of this session, which, how do you hold power to account? And if you have any specific examples where you felt you were being stonewalled, how do you respond to that, or how do you deal with that?
Sure. So one really easy way not easy. But one way that I think is an important and maybe not often, it's not glamorized enough, a way to hold power to account is to actually read the reports. To actually look through what agencies are saying and telling you and then check the facts. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been fed information that is not correct or that is maybe framed in a way, obviously they have a job to do. The people who put these reports together are highlighting their successes often, even if they are describing huge issues. And so I think looking at the data, looking at the descriptions in how something is being measured, so you can really easily take something without even having to do a records request. You can look at what's available and then actually start to have some of the information to ask those questions. So 2 examples that came from this. One was actually from when I was a local reporter in Oakland, and I was starting to look into toxic algae at a local lake. And starting to look at, okay, well, we know there are some problems here. This year after year, this is a place where people swim, recreate, they fish, and this lake was getting closed repeatedly for this toxic algae, was being cast as an issue from the environment. And looking at reports that were filed to the EPA, they're required by the city, started to piece together the fact that sewage spills were happening at this lake and with these old pipes. And you could see the different layers of documentation that showed the information being provided to the public on these spills was not the same information that was actually happening on the ground. So the people who were documenting these spills and registering them and measuring them were correctly doing so, and then through the city would filter through the agency and then be released, completely erasing the enormity of what was being released into these waterways, not only in this lake, but also into tributaries that go directly to the bay. And so through that reporting, I was able to uncover a shocking amount of sewage that led to several, federal investigations and violations of a consent decree. So that was one bigger aspect. And then one that's more recently happened. That's not necessarily something on that level of anything that's being covered up necessarily, but so we've been looking a lot at water policy. And recently, there was a story that came out, and the Newsom administration was heralding the end of the water wars. And if you take that at face value, it's really exciting news, right? And obviously, it's always wonderful to be able to highlight successes and to look at solutions and to see that, oh, these really contentious parties were coming to the table and negotiating and agreeing. But of course, that's not the full story. If you look deeper into the metrics, you start to see there are still issues. I mean, aside from the fact that not everybody was invited to the table, but the baseline that they were using was one borrowed from the Trump administration. So I think in those senses, then I was able to go back to the department and say, okay, why did you use this as a baseline? And they were like, well, that was the baseline we used, And so I think in those 2 situations, you can say, all right, if you take the documents that are public, that are available, and you just take those at face value, then your story is gonna be really different than if you actually try to make sure that the information you're being given is not only accurate, but framed correctly.
I mean, I think when we talk about accountability, going back to the sort of conversation earlier about investigations versus explanatory versus other types of journalism, to me, one of the kind of amazing things, especially when you think about the fossil fuel industry and climate accountability, is just how much information is sort of kind of already out there in the public realm, but in a way that, is just sort of like begging to have a light shone on it. So, I mean, this is the most obvious one, but campaign, finance disclosures. If you look at it's sort of well known in California that the oil lobby is very powerful in Sacramento, and you'll see that referenced a lot in stories about climate policy. It's like, oh, this is going to be a challenge, or this is challenging because the oil industry is against it, and oil industry workers are against it, and they're very influential. But what that's begging for, and which what's not always done but should be done, I think every time I was just doing this the other day. You go online to the campaign finance disclosure website, and it's very difficult to navigate, and it takes way longer than it should. But you you know, you go through there and you look and you figure out, okay, in the first quarter of this year, you know, among the top 5 donors were Western States Petroleum Association and the, you know, Chevron and Sempra Energy, which owns Southern California Gas Company. And, you know, you write, you know, you put those numbers into your story, and you know, you look at which lawmakers they're giving to and which of those lawmakers are on the committee that, you know, killed the bill in question, and what they've supported in the past that aligns with those companies' priorities. And all of that is out there in the public realm, but that doesn't mean it does not need to be, you know, sort of investigated and spotlighted. And, you know, just one more example of that, I referenced Southern California Gas, SoCal Gas. This is a company that I write about very frequently. They're the largest gas utility in the country. And, you know, I started to realize a couple of years ago in 2019, there were cities in California, starting with Berkeley, that we're passing these policies to ban gas hookups in new housing, in new homes and businesses. And, you know, the idea was to go all electric, so you're not using a fossil fuel anymore, electric heating, electric cooking. And, you know, people started to send me bits and pieces of information like, gee, there's this, you know, there's this group out there that seems to be associated with SoCal Gas that, you know, showed up at my city council and was arguing against doing something similar. And the SoCal Gas spokesperson was talking on their behalf. You should look at this. So, you know, you start looking out there and just Googling the name of this group, Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions. It's like, you know, I made a spreadsheet and started tracking it, and suddenly it's like, oh, you know, there's 50 different cities or more, or 60 or 70 where this group has showed up and been arguing against these policies. And, you know, I got some assist from researchers at watchdog groups that were looking into these folks as well. But you know, you just kind of do the homework on what's out there publicly, and at the end of the day, you have a story that says, you know, this front group basically that's funded by the gas company is, you know, out there aggressively lobbying. You know, I think it turned out to be like 110 or 120 city councils that they got to sort of join their side and agree not to do these types of gas bans. And, you know, that didn't require a public records request, which would have been, you know, there's opportunities for that are great. It didn't require a public records request. It didn't require insider sources. It didn't require people leaking information to me. It was putting together the pieces of what was out there that people hadn't put together and presenting them. So there's, I think with the fossil fuel industry, there are a lot of different opportunities for stuff like that. That's all I got.
Yeah.
I guess just to add to that, it's always like great to check on the ground if like things that are both in reports or that lawmakers say are true. And like one of my recent stories was about this like encampment of unhoused folks in Oakland, or well, I guess technically in Emeryville. And you know, Gavin Newsom had at one point like gone to an encampment where these people lived and like had been at the like cleanup eviction thing that happened, and was like, and then we got all these people housed. It was like, what, and you know, everybody got housed, and no, they had just moved like across a highway, and like they weren't you know, they didn't have shelter. And the story was sort of interviewing them and spending time with them, but you know, it's just like, it's just not true.
I have a question about funding. It sounds like your publications are able to finance your big stories, even if you don't want to call them big, because that's a no-no. But what about grant funding? Are you ever forced to go outside of your publication and seek out grants, or what do you think about that? I mean, because from my perspective, a lot of freelancers definitely have to go in search of a way to pay for these types of stories if they want to do them, because there just isn't the funding there sometimes.
I guess The Guardian is a nonprofit, and we do get a lot. I mean, like reporters aren't really involved in this as much, but you know, we have people at The Guardian who seek out grants to help fund our journalism. But also as a freelancer, when I was a freelancer, that was a huge like source of financial stability and like gave me more ability to do in-depth stories, was applying for, you know, grants through news organizations or, you know, news nonprofits to be able to like, not have to worry about making rent when you're spending a couple months on something.
Yeah, I guess too, like just to echo what Maanvi said, I think I for a long time was working in documentary. I think that was also like when you're working in certain visual mediums, something that can be so essential in helping to tell a story in a different way. So not only making sure that you as a reporter can be on the ground, and also to make the note of be on the ground safely. I think that's an area where grants can play a huge role in terms of gear, in terms of security, and even in terms of training. So I think often what we've been talking about in our newsroom is collective trauma and safety. So I think that if those opportunities exist, I think they're really important for both freelancers and for staff reporters to not only be able to, utilize different mediums in their reporting, but also to be on the ground safely. I haven't seen more from staffers, but I do think there are at least more, not necessarily opportunities, but I have seen a lot more, I think, organization. So I think that's been really encouraging to see different news organizations that want to offer that support, not only to like list grant opportunities or funding opportunities, but also to put forward programs and sort of advice to seek out that funding and those dollars.
What are techniques you use to structure your pieces so that they will have, hang on some telling detail or example that will make the stories more powerful?
That's a great question.
I highly recommend having a good editor that you can just like send garbage to and they'll help you. No. But yeah, I think like working with editors that you like trust and that could help kind of organize your thoughts or come in from like an outside perspective and say like, here's what I am getting from this, is that, or here's what I see as the most exciting point that needs to be up top. And of course, the other thing is just like spending time, looking for like real world impact of things, like spending time with people and having like stories to kind of show actually how this is working out in the real world.
So I have maybe this, I don't know. So the top of your story is so important, right? Everybody knows that, don't bury the lead. I also think the kicker is so important. And I know that like a lot of readers don't get to the kicker, and that breaks my heart a lot. But for me, it's like you tell this story and you're giving this information, you're structuring it in a certain way, but I always want to kind of leave the person on something solid. I usually try to work in a quote at the very end. And it's hard, right? Because you want to save some of your most compelling quotes. You want to have them at the top. You want to flesh that out. You want to draw someone in. But I think it's also really essential to have that that final just little nugget just to send someone on their way after they've read your piece. So that's something that I'm sure is not always favored for that very reason of the fact that people are very busy.
I gotta say, I teach journalism and I teach lead is the most important, kicker is number 2. Yes. Middle of the story is number 3. I'm looking at my students, so I know I'm talking about.
Love it, yes.
Sammy, any thoughts on how to organize or structure a narrative and make an investigation to also make it a narrative?
No, those were good pieces of advice.
Other questions? I'll jump in. So we touched a little bit on this, but this is really hard to do as a freelancer. Do you think it's possible to do really deep investigations without working on staff?
100%. I think that, it's obviously and I think, I don't know if all of us, I've worked as a freelancer for a long, long time. And there are incredible challenges that come with that. But I think there's also an incredible amount of freedom to really decide on what drives you and to go after it hard. And so I think obviously having the support of being in a newsroom is really helpful and wonderful. And it's also, I think, I've been really encouraged by a lot of the movement around support in freelance, I think, communities of reporters who I think are supporting one another in doing that work. And I think also the understanding that as a freelancer, like you're doing the same kind of work, just in a different, just maybe in a different space. So yeah, I think there are that freelancers do among the most compelling investigative work out there. That's my take.
I also worked as a freelancer, and the style of working, at least when I did it, was not my favorite compared to working in a newsroom, just because it was so hard to kind of, whatever, like, make it work financially. But I will say that, like, I mean, maybe this gets back to your first question about just what is an investigation. I think especially as a young freelancer, there was this sort of like impression I got that, like, in order to like be respected or be I don't know, like do good work, I needed to do this kind of like super, like lots of these super in-depth, exclusive, like high in, like time-intensive investigations. But I think that honestly, like, I think that is a narrow definition of investigation. And I think a lot of times, like, you got to do what you got to do to make it work financially, but sometimes it's just a matter of, like, doing lots of stories and getting interested in one topic, and that body of work forms your investigation, and maybe that is, like, more feasible to make it work financially, especially if you're, like, can't get a grant, or even if you do, like, grant money only goes so far, I don't know, just, like, I mean, maybe this is just more for, like, people who are, like, younger, starting out doing freelancing, but I think I, for a while, just felt like I wasn't doing enough if I was just doing quick stories in order to, like, make rent. And now I have a kind of wider perspective on that.
Cool. Anyone else? Any final thoughts you want to?
So we have one.
We got
one more
one.
question. Sorry. Oh, sure.
Thank you. Just following on from that last question, I just wondered if you guys had like pieces of advice you would give to your younger selves starting out, getting into this work, things you've learned from investigations you've done later in your career that you might apply to things you didn't know when you were starting out.
Oh, I think mine would be to, honestly, to give myself more breaks. I think that there's such a push in journalism, there's such a culture of stoicism that is coming back to haunt us. And for so much of my career, I refused to allow myself to fully process like the incredibly difficult topics that I was covering, and the human tragedies and the climate tragedies and the terror of that. And I know it just started to be so dark at the very end here, but I think that that's something that's really encouraging that we're starting to see come up in both newsrooms and in freelance communities, I'm hoping to a greater extent, of this idea of that we need rest just as much as everyone else. I think this applies to, especially to a lot of people in advocacy and scientists in this really difficult space in this climate crisis, and just being the messengers is a privilege, but it's also an incredibly heavy burden to carry sometimes. And so I think taking that step back, really looking at the work that you're doing and allowing yourself both to grieve and also to rest and heal would be my advice.
I endorse what Gabby just said, and I would add that in addition to the mental health benefits, which I'm still trying to internalize for myself as well as I think we all are, that I think that just makes the work better and more impactful too. I mean,
Totally.
sometimes as a journalist you can feel like, oh, I have to get to all of these different things, and I have to, both there's so much to cover, and I have to prove to my bosses and to readers how hyper-productive I am and how I can get to everything. But I almost never have people come, talking to me about my work and the readers and say, oh, I remember all that great coverage you did over a period of 6 months where you did 15 different stories on that thing. It's, oh, there's that one piece you did that really hit me. And it's like, you got to remember, we're here talking about investigations or whatever. The stuff that you go slower on, that takes longer, that requires work to get into, like, that's the stuff that's going to hit hard and that people are going to remember and it's going to make a difference. So if you're able, both for your own health and for the sake of the work, to slow down and remember that less can be better, I think that's good for a lot of reasons. Still trying to learn that one, but
Yes,
it's
same.
true.
Yeah, I guess kind of similar, but maybe not just for rest, is like, I wish I would have known that it was okay to say no more often. Sometimes just because I was overworked, sometimes because I was asked to do stories or pursue angles I didn't believe in, and I would kind of say no or say it too timidly, and I wouldn't trust my own judgment, or I would feel like I didn't have a power, I didn't want to burn a bridge. And now I wish I had just sort of had more confidence to just be like, no, like I'll just not get myself involved in this, and yeah, maybe sleep more.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for our 3 amazing journalists today talking about their work.
And thank you for the wonderful questions.